Okay, good morning, everyone. I see that there are a few of you joining us still, but I don't want to keep you waiting too long so that you can hear everything that James has to say. So welcome. Thank you again for joining us for our annual Lumsden McCormick Exempt Organizations Conference. My name is Christine Prue, and I will serve as your host for this webinar session. First and foremost, please make sure your full name is listed in Zoom. You can change your name by hovering over your photos. There's 3 dots in the upper right-hand corner and rename. First and last names, please. This is especially important if you are requesting CPE certification or an attendance certificate. This webinar is being recorded, and once it's available, we will post it to the Lumsden McCormick website. And then also, if we are able to, we will be sharing slide decks for all sessions that are provided for. Now, the chat and the Q&A are enabled. Please make sure you add your questions for James in the Q&A box. We will be answering those questions at the end of the session. So as they come to your minds, though, please put them in that Q&A box. We are offering 1 hour of CPE credit for each webinar. Therefore, all polling questions must be answered. We will have 4 polling questions throughout this presentation, and your certificates will be emailed to you from support@prolera.com within 30 days of today. The subject line will read Lumsden McCormick CPE certificate. Also, at the end of the webinar, please complete the webinar survey, which will automatically launch. This is the webinar evaluation and is required for CPE credit. In addition to that, Prolera, when you receive your CPE certificate, will also contain a webinar evaluation. This evaluation is optional. However, we do appreciate any and all feedback you may have. Any questions related to any of these housekeeping items, please leave them in the chat or email Maria Gambacorda directly. Now, moving on to our webinar. We are happy to welcome James Evans today. He is the founder and chief executive officer of Companions and Animals for Reform and Equity. James is a multi-award winning creative strategist and leader with 25 plus years of experience developing relationships between organizations and their constituents. His expertise has been utilized across a diverse group of brands, both non-for-profit and for-profit. Specific brand experiences include Timberland, Disney, the Mills Corporation, and the NAACP. James and his team have initiated several programs, including the groundbreaking Gulf Spay Neuter campaign at HSUS's Pets for Life. In 2019, James founded Companions and Animals for Reform and Equity. James, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Christine, and thank you all for having me. I know this, you probably know from the title of this talk that we're going to be talking about what's typically referred to as DEI. At CARE, Companions and Animals for Reform and Equity, we refer to this conversation and conversations like it as REDI conversations, racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we're not the only ones that don't really use the DEI term straight away, mostly because it's interesting that the DEI starts with diversity. And as you all well know, this country by intention is already incredibly diverse. And so diversity is really not our struggle here. Our struggle is inclusion, and we suffer mostly from the lack of inclusion because we so often fail to deal with the racial implications of the country's history. And so at CARE, we start with race straight out of the box. And I'm looking forward to your questions afterwards. Just by the way, I am super hard to offend. I'm offended by intention only. Any question you have, no matter what it is, I'm here for it. You're not going to hurt my feelings. It's probably not going to be the first time I've been asked. So I'm going to get into some of the slide presentation. By all means, use the chat, by the way. I probably won't respond in chat because I'm actually focused on talking to you. But Christine is going to give me some feedback on the chat as we close out. With that, I'm going to share my screen. Just bear with me for 1 second. Okay, well, I did that wrong. Hold on 1 second. I guess I'll start with the share part. Okay, let's see. Sharing the wrong screen. And yes, I've done this before. Let's see, let's go up to this first slide. All right, so hopefully you all can see my screen. I'm going to trust that. Otherwise, we're going to be in bad shape. All right, so as I said earlier, I'm from CARE, Companions and Animals from Reform and Equity. We were founded in 2019, just before the pandemic and shortly before the unfortunate murder of George Floyd. So I will get into CARE's mission briefly, but essentially the animal welfare field is incredibly not diverse. And animal welfare includes everything from sheltering to foster and adoption of animals. When you see those Sarah McLachlan ads on television from the ASPCA or the Humane Society of the United States, those ads fall within the animal welfare sphere. So pet adoption, pet fostering, sheltering, that is all considered animal welfare or animal protection. That also includes animal control, by the way. Long story short, the field is not very diverse. And in 2019, ahead of George Floyd's death, a large funder approached me and asked, based on the work that I'd done in the field already, if I would be willing to launch a institutional organization that focused on bringing more diversity to the field. And we launched CARE in 2019, and George Floyd was murdered shortly after, which brought a lot of attention to the organization. Nevertheless, here we are. And one of the struggles that I have noticed throughout my entire career, really my entire life, is that in this country anyway, we fail to just dive in and talk about race. And one of the struggles that we have when we're talking about race is, I think, the struggle with the way we think about history. As you see here, history is a seed, is not a timeline. So often we think about history as, one event happens, then the next event happens, then the next event happens, without any ligatures whatsoever to the pre-event. And so often we think about slavery as something that happened a long, long time ago. It happened, the slaves were set free, and those folks just went on their merry little way, happy as larks, right? But not very often do we think about what really happened after slavery, which was the mass reincarceration of people of color through the prison system. Black Americans were not criminalized as a whole until slavery was over. There's no reason to criminalize someone that is working for you for free under slavery. There's no reason at all to have the sheriff on your property arresting people that you need for labor. And so Jim Crow, the KKK, all of those things, lynchings, those happened after slavery was over. And so this idea that Black Americans were free and then went on their merry way, is it just doesn't make sense in the course of history. Some would argue that things got worse for Black Americans after slavery was actually over, because at that point, African Americans weren't valuable property. If you imagine African Americans as a really, really, really expensive tractor, or some other type of mechanism, slave owners did not go out of their way to mistreat this thing that they spent a good deal of income on. So when we think about George Floyd's death, and we think about the way in which George Floyd was murdered in public, and pretty mercilessly, those things aren't things that happen on a timeline. That's not, those things are in conjunction with slavery. No different than this image here, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which is, I don't know if you all noticed, but this room is predominantly filled with men. The founding of this country, I would venture to say, was a very male-dominated activity. There are no women in this room whatsoever. There are probably essential women in the room, but they certainly aren't pictured. And so, the connection between the absence of women, the absence of women's voices, the absence of female signatures in everything that founded this country is directly connected to why women today still are making 82 cents on the dollar compared to their male counterparts doing the same work. So I think it's important that we recognize, as we move forward, talking about things that are tangential to your field, that your field, just like the animal welfare field, just like policing, just like education, just like healthcare, are all inside of this bubble we call America, which is hugely and unfortunately influenced by racism, slavery, and sexism. Almost all of our current struggles, even the struggle of COVID, is connected to these things. There are more brown women specifically who died from COVID than any other group in this country. And those things are directly connected to the lack of brown people and the lack of women in this very coveted photograph or illustration. So, ready for the first polling question.
Okay, everyone, here is our first polling question. According to Forbes, in what year will African Americans reach pay parity with their white counterparts? We will just give this a few moments so everybody has the opportunity to respond. Okay, I see about 85% of our participants have voted. So if everybody just takes a moment to vote here to make sure you get that CP credit as well. And so we have great engagement, and I will close this out in just a couple of seconds. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share our results.
That is 2089, 63%. So whoever voted for that was closest. It's actually 2116, according to Forbes. Way outside of any of our lifetimes, by the way. So I thought that was a good polling question for this team of folks who are dealing with numbers all the time and economic issues. And obviously, again, back to slavery, there are very few business economic advantages better than employees that are willing to work for free. And so if you've got a firm of accountants and they're all working for free, you have an enormous advantage, especially if they're working for free for, I don't know, 400 years, right? You are going to eradicate your competition, unless, of course, your competition then engages in that same behavior where they're getting people to work for free. So for African Americans, and not just African Americans, but people of color in general, but specifically for African Americans, you can see the cost of the economics of revolving slavery. All right, I'm going to the next slide, or at least I'm trying to. Okay, so that is my crazy and loving family. I was born in Baltimore City, Baltimore, Maryland. For many people, unfortunately, consider Baltimore an incredibly dangerous place. But I like to tell folks that I was born in Baltimore, but I was raised inside of 5709 Gist Avenue, which was my parents' home. And no matter how loving my community is, I am still perceived as coming from incredibly dangerous place. If I'm traveling, and I travel a lot, so often the plane arrives at BWI Airport, and folks on the plane that are new to Baltimore will ask me if there is somewhere safe for them to eat. That's how endemic the concept of Baltimore and other brown cities like Baltimore and Detroit are closely related to danger and violence. And it's not that those things don't exist here. Wherever you have a depressed people, a segregated people, a suppressed people, you're going to find violence. Violence and poverty, unfortunately, work hand in hand. But very rarely does anyone presume that there is love and affection and intelligence and genius in these communities. I grew up in the city. I had a fine art background, graphic design background, photography background. I became incredibly excited about wildlife and photography, which is my book behind me, is a book about really being African-American in nature, which is a whole other talk in itself. But wildlife and wildlife photography is also a not very diverse space. This is just a photograph of mine. So that is a drawing of mine of an African style chess piece that I own. Hopefully you don't hear that annoying beeping. But this is, I'll tell you, I went to fine art school, and what was interesting about being in fine art school is that I spent my whole high school high school career in fine art, and 2 years before that, and then I went to industrial design school, and my entire experience in art, I always had art history every year, and not one year for the 8 or 9 years that I was in studying art and design that I had a single lesson in African art. Not one African artist, not really, a few Asian artists sprinkled in there, but it's just interesting to me. This is how white and dominant the country is. And it's not that I did not learn and appreciate the classics, but it was only until I was in my late 40s that I realized that I had not learned anything whatsoever about the African continent. And so it's almost inescapable how diversity is, the lack of diversity or the lack of inclusion, I should say, is so predominant in this country. So that's just a little bit about me. Let's talk about equality versus equity. So often in this country, we talk about equality, we talk about, equal, let's give everybody the same thing and just close the door, we're done, wash our hands of it, we're doing a great job. But we don't really think so much about what equity looks like, especially racial equity. And so equity is different. Equity requires thoughtfulness. It requires taking some time to listen and to accommodate, to truly accommodate. And for those who build businesses, doesn't matter if it's an accounting firm, doesn't matter if you're a CFO and you have a large set of people working under you, creating safe space, creating equity, always transforms into better work habits, more production, more creativity, and so on. I mentioned earlier that my current field is the field of animal welfare, which is not too dissimilar to the field of accounting in that it is incredibly white, and in many ways predominantly female in some instances. And I don't know if you all have ever heard of the Harvard Project Implicit study. If you haven't, please take note of Harvard Project Implicit. Project Implicit is a is a study to test one's biases. It could be bias on anything. They have several different categories, but their racial bias test, I think, is one of their more popular tests. And so when we started CARE, we reached out to Harvard Project Implicit right away and asked that they tweak their test a little bit so that the questions in the survey were reflective of things within animal welfare. And it was really, really interesting what came out of the test, which, one could presume would, which was that in the animal welfare field, which again is predominantly white, 70% of the people polled, and there were like 3,800 people polled, by the way. This was a pretty significant data set. 70% of the people said that they were pro-white and 30% said they were pro-Hispanic. And then if you go next down the line, when African Americans enter into the poll, it's 79% pro-white and 21% had an issue with African Americans. And then the next grouping was obviously poverty, people who lived in poverty. 3% of the audience basically liked or were welcoming to people that lived in poverty, but most of the audience was anti-poverty and pro-wealthy. What is kind of insane about this is that most of the people, when asked implicitly about which they preferred, they said the opposite of the way they tested. So in short, people say all the time that race doesn't matter, that they have no issue with people in poverty, but when they're tested unconsciously, our unconscious biases come out all the time. And it's something that we really have to be cognizant of, because those are the real barriers to making change and making people feel comfortable and welcoming. Those are the real barriers to equity, is really what we're thinking. And so I work in a field that prefers to be around wealthy people, that prefers to be around white people, that are okay with Hispanic people for many reasons, because in some instances, one can't tell whether or not someone is Hispanic or white unless they self-identify. But African-American people, per most places in the country, really a negative feeling towards African-Americans. And again, this does not drop out of the sky. This is directly related to slavery and the seed of white supremacy. Ready for the next polling question.
Okay, I've launched a second polling question. This is a two-part question for everybody to note. The first question is income inequality between white and Black Americans worse today than in 1979? And then the second part of this question is simply, are you attending this webinar to earn CPE credits? So especially if you are here to earn CPE credit, make sure you answer both parts of this question. So I will leave this up for a few minutes. And James, just so you are aware, we have about 20 minutes left in time.
Yep.
Okay, and I will give everybody a few more seconds, but I see that almost everybody has participated in our polling questions. So if you have not, now is your chance. Okay, and I'm going to close out the polling question and share those results.
All right, so I see almost everyone's here for CPE, and some not. I'd be interested to know later for the folks that aren't here for the CPE, why are you here? You can put that in the chat. And I'm sure there's a combination of both. We are actually income equality is actually worse now than it was in 1979. As folks who are dealing with numbers and fiscal issues, you can imagine that with a gap growing between wealthy and non-wealthy, that you're going to see more African Americans on that non-wealthy side, unfortunately. And that doesn't mean that there's nothing happening. It doesn't mean that there's no progress. It just means the progress is slow, very slow. I'll give you a chance to read this. So again, your field, like many others, is professional fields, is predominantly white. There has been a significant amount of growth in the accounting field, but still, you can see the stats. And what I like to point people to is quite often these facts are separated throughout industry or subject matter. But I like to point out that there is, as I don't know a subject, anything that is socially focused or industry focused, where African American people are not at the very bottom of any kind of polling. And I think we have to be honest again with ourselves and really choose, right? Is it that African American people are by nature inferior, or is there a system that constantly holds African Americans to the bottom rungs of everything measurable in our society? Over 80%, 88% of CEOs, CFOs, and COOs in the 2022 report are Caucasian, and 88.1% are men. Obviously, there is progress. There's always progress. But if you ask me, that slow arc of justice needs to be straightened out so that it's easier to make progress completely across the board. I'm a brother with 3 sisters and no other brothers, and I see the difference between the way my sisters are presented in workspaces than even myself. So we have a lot of work to do. I love this quote. We don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. Ready for the next polling question.
Okay, here's the next one's up. Black, Indigenous, and people of color rank lowest in almost all things socially measurable because, and there's those 3 choices there. And we'll just give everybody a little bit longer. I see all those responses coming in. Okay, everyone, I'm going to give you about 5 more seconds to answer this so James can continue on with his presentation, getting those votes in. Okay, we will end our poll and I will share the results.
All right, that's not too bad, even though I gave you a hint before the slide started. So, but that's pretty good. And that is the truth. It is, I see here there are 2% of people who say that BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color rank lowest because they're not naturally intelligent. I'd like to think that was an accidental pick, but 2% of you seem to think that that is true. Another 8% of you believe that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are naturally intelligent, but we're a bit lazy. So 10% out of the 119 really believe the conditions that people of color live in have nothing to do with systematic racism. I would say that's a pretty high number, but that is what it is. Christine, we can go to the next.
Next polling question. Oh, no. Okay.
Oh, sorry. So
No, that's okay. Just wanted to make sure. Go on.
No worries. So racial equity will provide access and resources and restorative justice. This illustration we did here at CARE to kind of illustrate the way forward. And the way forward is bridge building. Obviously, there is an enormous amount of change. And I'm glad to see it. It's just not happening very quickly. And as you can see, regardless of the change, African Americans are still at the bottom. The slowest form of change happens in African American communities and African American households. Second to African Americans are Hispanic Americans. And I don't know if you all know this factoid, but early in, well, mid 1920s, there was a lot of concerted effort to qualify Asian Americans as the better of the people of color. And Asian Americans to date still benefit from sort of white supremacist governors and legislatures pushing and arguing that Asian Americans were the more dutiful people of color, and Asian Americans still benefit from that sort of concept. The golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That is really the way forward. We know, which I'll let you read through this, that even the name, your personal name has an effect on your application and how you're hired. And I would say for those that are in positions of hiring managers, executives, I think we just have to ask ourselves, is that how you would want your resume to be welcomed? By firstly saying, hey, does my name sound Hispanic? Does it sound like a Jewish last name? Does it sound ethnic? And therefore, I must not be qualified. So if my name is Tay, quite often my resume is not even going to be looked at. And I think, contrary to popular belief, the playing field is just not equal. And racism and sexism, unfortunately, have a lot to do with who gets hired and who does not. The good news in all of this is that for those who practice equity in a real earnest way, the profits are there. People who are in a safe space bring them their whole selves, which means their whole genius, their whole creativity. And I would never argue that someone should just hire African Americans just for hiring African Americans or Asian Americans or women. But what's interesting about all of us is our lived experience. And so often the lived experience of Indigenous Americans or African Americans or women, those lived experiences are not brought to executive level positions. God only knows where we would be if there were more people of color and more women in that room, in that illustration where the Declaration of Independence was being signed. Where were the homemakers? Like, where were the women of the day bringing their lived experience into the writing and signing of that Declaration of Independence? I think a lot of our current struggles wouldn't exist if there was more diversity from the very beginning. Or I shouldn't say more diversity, but more inclusion from the very beginning. I think this is the last polling question.
Yes, it is. It is who would benefit most from monetary reparations paid to African Americans? So we'll give everybody some time. And James, just so you know, there are about 10 minutes left in the presentation time.
Great.
Okay, we'll just give everybody a few more seconds here. We have about 88% responding. Okay, everyone got those votes in, and I'm going to close the poll. And here are the results.
So the winner is everyone, right? I can see why folks would say African Americans, because we think about justice being one-sided so often, right? When we send someone to prison, we think it is the family of the victim that's made whole, right? When really it's everyone is made whole when a rapist is put in jail. Not just the victim is made whole, but the whole of society is safer when a murderer is no longer amongst us. And so if reparations ever occurred and there was a rebalancing of wealth, right, which is not justice, because you can't take back 400 years of slavery and then all the years of Jim Crow that followed. But if there was a rebalancing, any rebalancing, I know California is probably going to be the first to consider and possibly pass some form of reparations where as much as $200,000 might be given to African-American descendants. Does it benefit those African-American descendants almost immediately? Absolutely. But the reality is that African-Americans don't own the predominant land in the country. African-Americans don't own the predominant blocks of the economy. So someone with $200,000 is going to buy a house. They're going to buy a car. They're going to go onto furniture stores. They're going to purchase things, and they're going to purchase those things from whom? From people who already own those commodities and will be selling those commodities at a profit. And so those people like Jeff Bezos and Amazon, if every African American in this country, not just California, were to have a windfall of $200,000 instantly put in their bank accounts, Jeff Bezos would see an enormous profit. And then the country would tax Jeff Bezos and everything connected to those profits, which everyone wins when there's a tax base, right? I live in a city with a tax base of somewhere around $26,000 to $30,000, which is directly connected to the lack of employment, gainful employment in the city. So unfortunately, the city is so often, Baltimore is so often polarized around middle-class white Americans not wanting to invest in underserved African-American neighborhoods without realizing that all of the boats in the harbor are raised when none of the boats are sinking. We share this economy. And so I ask this question of all of you because you're dealing with figures and finances all the time. And I think if we think about race and equity as a win-win for everyone, it actually is a win-win even financially. That is why in the Kensington report, it shows that businesses that are equitable actually are more profitable and more creative. And so I think that is a good place to end, because the reality is that slavery was about money. And everything that happened after that was about emotional loss of that income and, resetting things so that there's more equity in hiring practices is only going to benefit everyone. So I do appreciate you all hanging in there with me.
Thank you so much, James. Just a reminder to everybody, if you have questions to ask, there is the Q&A box or the chat. So please feel free. We have a few minutes here right now to ask any questions that you may have. James, I will give you, it's kind of more of a comment, but maybe you could speak on it. Somebody spoke about the third question, the third polling question, and they said that they felt that the question was designed to be answered, that the system is geared to being white. And they said maybe something has to be accomplished in the neighborhoods and schools to make parents more accountable. I'm not sure if you have any thoughts or feelings on that you'd like to address.
So I would say for that anonymous attendee that neighborhoods and schools and Black and brown neighborhoods and schools are a byproduct of redlining. And there is no parity in African-American neighborhood schools, meaning that the white districts in the city, in Baltimore and almost in every metropolitan city, receive a considerable more funding. They're advocated for differently. Redlining was a process, by the way, a government process. This is not just individual and industry, but redlining is one of the primary reasons why African-American homes are less valuable. The tax base is lower. And so the school system that exists inside those redline communities also have less per student income. And so, that question, anonymous question, comes out of a thinking that we should hold brown and Black folks more accountable. And if they would just pull themselves up from their own bootstraps, then, they will be better off. But that's just simply untrue, and it doesn't fall in line with the nature of what white is anyway. Like white is a byproduct of creating advantage, and that started from the early days. There's a reason why people here don't call themselves German and French and other European things. White was designed to be the predominant power in this country, and it is today. There's just no way around it. I would encourage the person that ask that question to read a book called Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. It's a great book. It's all history, it's American history, but it takes you step by step through the American caste system. And caste is above race. This is all about how we went from rural caste systems, monarchies, to where we are today. And it's an easy read, and I think it's fundamental.
Okay, thank you, James. We have not had any further questions come through, but everybody, I've put James's website in the chat. So we do encourage you to reach out to James to continue on with this. Oh, actually, we do have one more. James,
Oh,
could you please
Yep, I
repeat
just
the
saw
author and
that.
the book title?
Yeah, it's so Isabel Wilkerson is a Pulitzer Prize winning author, by the way. Incredible author. Her first book was the Great Migration. Oh no, I'm sorry. It was called The Warmth of Other Suns, which is about the Great Migration of African Americans moving from the South to the North. Her second book is called Caste. Her name is Isabel Wilkerson. She's a Pulitzer Prize winning author, formerly a journalist. For those of you, particularly the 10% of you, which I'm assuming the person that asked that, not the last question, but the original question, the person that asked that question, I'm assuming, is probably within the 10% that really believe that the condition of BIPOC, and particularly African Americans in this country, are actually their own fault, some sort of systematic deficiencies inside of Brown and Black communities. I challenge you to read one of those two books, because the American school system actually does not teach BIPOC history, does not teach African American history. African Americans, Latino Americans, we have to learn that on our own. And so what Isabel Wilkerson has done, I think, is beautifully illustrated the history of this country. So I challenge you to read, in particular, Caste. It's a really phenomenal book to read from.
Thank you, James. And everybody, you can see in the chat, I did put the Amazon links for both of her books there. So of course, can purchase them wherever you find them, but they are there so you can easily access them and save them to your Amazon carts. I'm looking right now and I do not have any other questions coming through. So with that, I will put the information for our next session in the chat. And thank you to everyone for attending. And James, especially, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to speak with us today.
Of course. And thanks for having me.
Thank you. Okay, everyone, we will see you on the next session and have a great day if you will not be with us for the rest of the day. Thanks again, James. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.